By the 15th century, Europe is a very different place. The climate of Europe has changed, most notably because of the Renaissance, as well as the other developments that we have been and will be talking about. There's a new interest in ideas and a new interest in products from the rest of the world, most notably from Eastern Asia. There's a new way of seeing themselves and relating to each other. And the result is that other things change too. For example, the structure of business begins to change. Businesses become larger. They're reaching out more and they're competing on a much greater circle than they had been before. It's no longer local. A nice example of this might be in the area around Florence, Italy, where it's estimated that there were about 200 wool weavers employing about 30,000 workers during the time of the Renaissance. But wool comes from sheep, and sheep grow the best wool in places other than Italy. Indeed, they do much better in the north, places like the Netherlands and Belgium and so on. And so the wool weavers of the north in places like Belgium or the Netherlands have cost advantages and better quality wool in order to compete with the wool weavers of Florence. And so the weavers of Florence are going to be forced to look elsewhere. If they're going to continue to make wool and sell wool, they're going to have to find either cost advantages or new markets they can sell into. And they find that the ability to do that is being impeded, particularly by the rise of the Ottomans, who are now the gatekeepers to Eastern Asia, adding cost to the trade routes, reducing accessibility to other people. There becomes a burning need to find a way around the Ottomans and the Muslim world. If trade is going to take place with Eastern Asia, it's got to come a different way. And the result is the Age of Discovery, which is taking place at the very same time as the High Renaissance. The Age of Discovery is perhaps best, so let's quickly define those three E's. A little bit ominous sounding perhaps, but the three E's of the Age of Discovery are exploration, extermination, and exploitation. And so we should look at each in their turn. Perhaps the largest of those E's is this idea of exploration. And indeed, exploration is a big part of this. It's driven by, I guess we could say, 4 G's. We don't have any F's. We go from E to G, but there are 4 G's that really make exploration happen. The first are gadgets. How very Renaissance-like that gadgets would be an important part of this. The attempt to use new technology and new knowledge and ideas to harness and control nature and make things work better. Navigation aids being a big part of this in terms of the age of exploration. Navigation aids were introduced like new charts of the skies and the seas, the compass which was brought in from China through the Ottoman Empire, the introduction of the water clock, stern rudders, new sails, all kinds of navigation aids, but also of importance, the introduction of new ships. Ships that began to be bigger and better able to cope with the challenges of exploration in the open water of the ocean. Originally, Spain and Portugal had used carracks, C-A-R-R-A-C-K-S. But eventually other ships were adopted as well. Portugal and then Spain, for example, adopted the caravel, a somewhat larger ship than a carrack, but not very large, generally 2 or 3 masts at first. Some of them eventually became 4-masted, but more maneuverable than the other ships. They could go up rivers. They could explore the shallow coastal waters. Very economical to operate and much faster than some of the other ships. And then Spain also adapted the galleon, a much larger ship. The galleon really was there for large open water sailing, carried very large payloads, fast enough to outrun the pirates. This was a major cross-oceanic type of a ship. Initially, they were using the smaller ones. The Nina and the Pinta were caravels. The Santa Maria, the third ship that Columbus used, a carrack. But so these ships become an important part of it. Other types of gadgetry also become part of exploration. It's not just navigation. It's things like the need to protect the payloads on these ships and to protect the sailors, especially since relatively small crews would work many of these ships. And so the introduction of gunpowder weaponry, most notably the introduction of cannons onto the ships, that becomes an important part of the gadgetry of the Age of Exploration as well. The second G that is an important one is glory. Glory is important because the states found themselves sponsoring voyages. And in doing so, they gained prestige for themselves. This was a way for the ruler of the state, whether it be Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain or others, to enhance their reputation and that of their nation. And all of this becomes an important part of it, the sheer glory of exploration. And indeed, God is also an important factor, the third of the G's. Religion travels with the sailors, and the sailors felt an obligation to introduce their religion to the people that they saw, to convert those of the outside world, to bring them the word of Christianity. Now, some do this more than others. Spain, for example, as a Catholic nation, was very big on trying to convert the natives that they found in the New World. England, a little less worried about that. As a Protestant nation, they were just as happy to just get rid of and displace the natives as they were to try to actually convert them. But this idea of exporting God is an important one. God is also a factor, too, in the opportunity for many of these people to escape religious persecution and find potential religious freedom. Remember, the timing we're talking about here is now the 1500s, the very age of the Reformation and the religious wars that we have just finished talking about in all of Europe. And so we have groups, the obvious one being the Puritans, for example, who fled England to Massachusetts for an opportunity to practice their own religion. And the last G, the fourth G, is gold. Gold becomes an important part of what drives all of this, both literally and figuratively. There were a lot of things that the Europeans wanted out of Eastern Asia. Silk, cotton, spices, and so on. But the Asians really didn't see much in Europe that they wanted in return. They weren't impressed with the goods of Europe. So the only thing they tended to take in exchange for their goods was precious metals. And so the Europeans were forced to go out looking for gold, for precious metals. And indeed, they found them. Lots of gold in Africa, as well as the gold, the profit, if you will, in the slave trade. In the case of the New World, they found other things. Some gold, but probably more importantly, silver. Vast deposits of silver that become an important part of the colonial environment in the New World. But it's also more than precious metals. There are bankers and merchants and others of the middle class that are there to finance the exploration. But if they're going to finance it, they want something in return. Most notably, a share of profits. They want gold back, and they'll take gold in any way that they can make. The second E is extermination. And here we're talking about the extermination not only of the people that were found by the explorers. The picture you see here showing the impact of smallpox on the Native Americans, but also the extermination of their culture, of their way of life. And so the citizens of the New World found that they paid the price in many different ways. The last of the E's is exploitation. Largely self-explanatory, I suppose, but we're talking about exploitation not only of resources, of crops and natural raw materials that were found in the New World, but also the exploitation of people, most notably, of course, slavery. The introduction of slavery from Africa, and indeed the exploitation of the natives from the New World as well, became an important part of the story of the Age of Discovery. It all begins really with Portugal. The Portuguese rise to power in the later 1400s as the first nation that truly sees and begins to make progress with this plan. And the guy that really kicks it off is a fellow by the name of Henry the Navigator, a prince in the royal family who as early as the 1430s was trying to figure out how to get to Eastern Asia and bypass the Muslim world. And he saw the answer to that being in bypassing Africa. Just sail around that little area and no problem, you'll be able to do that. And so Henry the Navigator began to sponsor voyages, began to sponsor schools of navigation, where he taught the explorers how to find their way at sea, how to handle themselves, and so on. It came to fruition during the years of the 1490s, most particularly with the voyages of a guy by the name of Vasco da Gama. Da Gama is arguably one of the most important of the explorers, as important perhaps, or even more so maybe, as Christopher Columbus. In 1497, Vasco da Gama made it all the way to India and back. And what's so critical about this is that when he did so, he returned with spices and cotton and other products that were worth over 60 times the cost of his voyages. What he did by doing this is two things. Number one, he proved that it could be done. You can go around Africa, make it to India, make it back around Africa, and do it in a more or less reasonable amount of time. The other thing is that he proved it is economically viable to do so. 60 times the cost of your voyage is a pretty hefty profit margin. And that is what will really drive the Age of Discovery, is that opportunity to make money. Now, Da Gama had his dark side, too. He returned to India in 1502 in a voyage that is much less talked about. This time he brought 21 more ships with him so that he could fight the Arabs and other Muslims that he found along the way, and would send a message to the Indians about the importance of trading with the Portuguese. Indeed, he butchered his victims and sent back body parts, hands, ears, noses, and so on, to the mainland, warning them to either deal with him or else. And so, as ugly as that might be, the Portuguese became rivals to the Italians, Venice and the other trading states, and then displaced them and became dominant in all of this. By 1504, spices in Lisbon cost 1/5, 20% of the price of the same spices in a place like Venice. They had become profitable and successful on an immense scale. By 1514, the Portuguese made it past India. They made it all the way to Indonesia and to China, made it to Japan even later. It was 1542, but again, the Portuguese were the first to get there. And of course, this contact is difficult for both sides. For example, in Southeast Asia, there are major adjustments that have to be made from the contact that had never before occurred between European and this part of Asia, at least. For example, Southeast Asia, women are the ones who conduct trade. It is not men's work to trade goods. Europeans, they don't want to deal with women. Women are not people that do business, and they don't know how to handle this. And so there's going to be a lot of details and issues to work out as these cultures clash and make contact with each other. But ultimately, they do. The Portuguese ran into other issues. One of their ships was blown off course in the Atlantic as it was trying to circle around Africa, and a little oops, ended up in Brazil, and so in about 1500, Brazil became a colony of the Portuguese, territory that was claimed by them. Generally, however, the Portuguese didn't try to make colonies. They weren't strong enough. They weren't big enough to try to exert their will on places like India or China. And so they really ended up focusing on their contacts with Africa and Brazil, and even there they didn't create colonies, except in the case of Brazil. They went along the shore creating fortresses that they could trade off of and reprovision their ships, and let the natives continue to hold the territory and bring goods to the coast to trade with the Portuguese. It's important also that the Portuguese found one other major innovation as they began to circle Africa, and that one was done on a series of islands off the African coast, where they found that they could grow sugar and do so very profitably. But sugar is extremely labor-intensive to grow. The conditions are brutal. The work is difficult. And so what they found is they were going to have to find workers to do that sugar harvesting. Where do you find workers? There weren't enough in Portugal, and they were too far away and not interested in that kind of work. And so the Portuguese introduced African slaves to these farms, what became plantations, and the islands off of Africa.